Share my screen.
Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to VMACS. This is going to be the last session for this spring season. So look out for any announcements for the fall, which will come later on. So for today, we have two sets of speakers as usual. First, Alessandra, who will talk for 10 minutes, and then Conor Walsh will talk for the next 40 minutes. And then there's going to be a 10-minute Q&A section, mainly on Conor's discussion. So if in the meantime you have any clarifying questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom. And for the in-person Q&A at the end, you will be able to raise your hand and ask your question in person. And also, we will host, as usual, a Zoom room after the two talks at 1 p.m. The link for that Zoom room is in the chat. And you, if you want to participate in the Zoom room, make sure you look at the invitation there. That will start at 1 p.m. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is being recorded, so just keep that in mind, and will be posted on YouTube later. So without further ado, I'm going to give Alessandra the floor to present her paper on nonlinear pricing and misallocation. Thanks, Alessandra.
Great. Can you all hear me? Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks a lot to the VMACS team for giving me the opportunity to present this brand new project, which is joint work with Gideon Bornstein. So in this paper, we offer a new perspective on the misallocation of production, and we do that by taking a closer look at firms' pricing behavior. We're of course not the first to think about markups and misallocation, and in fact, there's an active literature in macro and firm dynamics about this topic. All of these papers have one critical assumption in common, which is linear pricing. This means that firms post a per unit price, and then consumers can buy any quantity they want at that constant price. The robust result from that literature is that firms that charge high markups are too small relative to the efficient allocation. In this paper, we relax the assumption of linear pricing and instead allow firms to offer basically any contract they want. And we show that this seemingly minor change to what firms are allowed to do in terms of pricing fundamentally changes the relationship between markups and misallocation. With nonlinear pricing, markup dispersion is actually no longer a sign of misallocation. And in the model I'll show you in a couple of minutes, there's actually no misallocation across firms at all, despite the fact that different firms charge different markups. The model also implies that we should actually be thinking about a different kind of misallocation, which is across consumers of the same firm. In the paper, we then extend the model to have endogenous labor supply and show that this entirely flips the classic result, and the market share of high markup firms is actually larger than in first best. Now, before I give you a little bit more intuition behind the result, let's briefly talk about nonlinear pricing and data. So when you go to CVS, you can buy any number of small packages of Advil for $5.29 a piece. This sounds a lot like linear pricing, but you can also go and buy a large pack, pay 9 cents per tablet instead of 22. This kind of quantity discount is a classic example of nonlinear pricing. And the same actually applies in the quality dimension. So the iPhone, for instance, comes in various models, and there's in principle nothing restricting Apple to charge the same markup for these different quality levels. To make the case slightly less anecdotally, we're in a process of systematically documenting pricing patterns in consumer packaged goods. And for the subset of industries that we've looked at so far, we find that more than 80% of sales are products that are sold in multiple sizes. And those price differences across sizes are large. On average, a 10% increase in package size is associated with a 7% decline in the price per unit. All right, now that I've hopefully convinced you that firms do indeed charge nonlinear prices, let me summarize why this changes the way we think about misallocation. Now, in the standard model with linear pricing, consumers choose the quantity that equates marginal utility to the price of the good. The price, by definition, is equal to the markup times the marginal cost. Now, a social planner would equate the same marginal utility to the real marginal cost. So from this equation, you can already directly see that first, any markup heterogeneity across firms J induces misallocation. And second, because utility is concave, firms that charge those high markups are underproducing relative to the efficient allocation. Now, this was the quick and dirty intuition because for instance, I punted on the fact that also the aggregate price on XP is going to be different between market and planner. But indeed, there is this large literature that confirms the intuition and shows that even in GE, high markup firms are underproducing and should be subsidized. Now, in our paper instead, we're going to relax this assumption of linear pricing and show that it entirely breaks the link between markups and misallocation. Now, to build the intuition, let's first look at the extreme case of perfect price discrimination. So in this world, Apple knows exactly how much, for instance, Stefania values the iPhone. So Apple's going to make her a take it or leave it offer for the iPhone model that maximizes her consumer surplus, and the allocation is first best. Why is that the case? Well, Apple can extract the full consumer surplus, so Stefania's surplus becomes Apple's objective function. In this world, any markups that she's charged actually tell us nothing about misallocation because Stefania is not on this kind of first order condition like we have above. Now, of course, in practice, there's a lot of consumer heterogeneity that might not be fully observable by the firm, and that's the model that we're actually going to be studying in the paper. So how does that change pricing strategy? Well, now Apple is going to sell a different quality iPhone to Stefania and to Gideon. But Apple needs to make sure that Gideon, who really wants the latest fancy iPhone, is not going to pretend to be okay with Stefania's iPhone SE to save on those costs. To achieve that separation, Apple's going to distort the allocation. And that's precisely why we're going to get misallocation between consumers. But different firms are actually going to choose the same wedge. So Advil and Apple choose the same wedge. So the intuition from before of perfect price discrimination still applies, and there's going to be no misallocation between firms. Okay. Let me jump to the model. So it's going to be a static environment with, for now, inelastic labor supply. Consumers have preferences with variable elasticities of substitution, which is going to be the standard source of markup heterogeneity. Consumers also have idiosyncratic tastes for different goods. So each household has a high taste tau for a random subset of goods of measure pi. Oh, sorry, I just saw that the slides went too far. Firms are going to produce one variety each with a linear technology that uses only labor. They're heterogeneous in their cost of production denoted CJ. Now, the only restriction that we're going to place on firms' pricing behavior is that they have to offer a single pricing schedule to all consumers. You can think of this in kind of two ways, either as a legal requirement, or you can think of tau as capturing that component of consumer heterogeneity that's not observable. Now, in this environment, firms solve a classic mechanism design problem that you might or might not remember from first-year micro classes. Firms are going to choose a bundle of prices and quantities for each of the two types of consumers to maximize profits. Since they can make take it or leave it offers, they don't face the standard demand curve, but instead they need to satisfy two types of constraints. Both consumers need to have positive surplus from their bundle. Nobody can be forced to purchase. And each consumer has to prefer their bundle relative to the one designated for the other consumer. The optimal allocation is going to feature the classic properties of no distortion at the top and quantity rationing at the bottom. The intuition is that, well, Stefania is never going to try to buy the iPhone 12. She doesn't care about phones that much. So Apple can go ahead and maximize Gideon's surplus. But the cost of providing an iPhone to Stefania includes the shadow cost of making sure that Gideon's still going to be willing to pay the high price for his phone. The shadow cost actually simplifies to this marginal utility wedge that I haven't read. Now, the reason I put the two terms in the box here in quotation marks is that both of these are partial equilibrium results. So what we're going to do for kind of the rest of the talk is go from Mascalel, Winston, and Green to general equilibrium. Now, first, I want to point out that the partial equilibrium result actually can't clear the labor market. If all firms sell the optimal quantity at the top, but too little at the bottom, there's going to be workers left over. So in general equilibrium, then the price index is going to adjust to ensure labor market clearing. And as a result, the allocation for the high taste consumer is also going to be distorted. We formalized this in the paper in our first proposition, where we proved that in equilibrium, households consume too much of the good for which they have a high taste and too little of the goods for which they have a low taste. One corollary of this proposition is that the marginal utility wedge that, again, I put in red here is actually completely independent of firm productivity CJ. And that's going to be an important component for our second main result on misallocation across firms. To get there, we need one more step, and that's to have a quick look at how much iPhones relative to Advil Stefania consumes and Gideon consumes. With nonlinear pricing, the relative marginal utilities are actually simply equal to the ratio of costs, and that's exactly what they would be in the efficient allocation. All those marginal utility wedges cancel out. Now, the combination of the constant distortion within firms across consumers that I showed you before, And this result of no distortion across firms within a consumer actually implied that in general equilibrium, there's no misallocation across firms. This last statement is technically true only for a large class of preferences that we formally characterize in the paper. And for these preferences, we prove two propositions. First is that firm level production is exactly the same as in first best. So the total consumption of phones by Stefani and Gideon combined. Now, of course, there's still this misallocation across consumers. So you might think that a social planner would want to subsidize firms or subsidize or tax firms to correct that, but it turns out that the answer is no. And that's our second proposition. If the planner only has access to firm level taxes and subsidies, she cannot improve on the market allocation. Okay, let me quickly summarize. I skipped the first line in the interest of time, but we show in the paper that nonlinear pricing preserves the markup result, meaning under both of these assumptions, high productivity firms charge high markups. But with nonlinear pricing, it's no longer true that these high markups firms underproduce. And in fact, subsidizing them would actually worsen allocative efficiency. We also point to this new source of misallocation. High taste consumers are allocated too much of the good. This kind of misallocation is not present with linear pricing, even if you have the sort of unobserved consumer heterogeneity that we have in the paper. Okay. Like 30 seconds to go, let me conclude. We started from the observation that linear pricing is used frequently by firms. And we show that modeling this gives important insights into misallocation. In the baseline model with inelastic Mabus supply, there's no misallocation across firms, despite heterogeneity markups. Instead, we point to a new source of misallocation, which is across consumers of the same firm. In the paper, we then extend the model to allow for endogenous labor supply and show that that flips the result of the classic result, and the market share of high markup firms is actually too large. So let me conclude by asking, well, are these so-called superstar firms really too small, like seems to be the robust result from the macro and firm dynamics literature? Well, in this paper, we show that the answer might actually be no.
Well, thank you, Alessandra, for an excellent and very on time presentation. So the floor now goes to Conor.
Thank you very much. Let me just start the share here. Right, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be here in this last session for VMACS for a while. So this is joint work with Michael Peters, who's in the chat to answer any questions, and it's about population growth and firm dynamics. So I think it's no secret that population growth has been on a downward trend across many countries in the world for quite some time. So both developing and developed countries are seeing falls in their fertility rates that look like they're going to be sustained well into the future. So at least the United Nations thinks that population growth in most major world economies is going to keep trending down for the foreseeable future. So what we do in this paper is think about the implications of this long run, quite significant change in the macro environment for the process of firm dynamics and aggregate growth. So there is a large existing literature on the relationship between population growth and aggregate growth. What we're going to do in this paper is go a bit more granular and think about the effect on micro firm dynamics from changes in the aggregate environment and slowing population growth, and in turn, how those changes in firm dynamics feed back into changes in economic aggregates that we care about. So our contribution is really twofold. We're going to derive some precise theoretical predictions in a rather rich model of firm dynamics and growth. And these predictions are that lower population growth on the firm dynamics side is going to reduce entry and measures of creative destruction through changes in the incentives for innovators to enter. As creative destruction declines, that's going to increase concentration and average firm size. So you're going to get increases in the shares of employment of large firms, and it's going to endogenously change the firm age distribution and shift out firms to become older. In the aggregate, the reduction in creative destruction is going to affect the incentives of incumbent firms to charge higher markups because they're going to face less competition and less churn. It's going to lower productivity growth through a couple of different channels that I'll get into. But at the same time, there's going to be an increasing, there's going to be an offsetting effect that's going to be an increase in product variety. So the research intensity of the economy is going to increase endogenously as population growth slows down. And that's going to offset, at least temporarily, some of the long run declines in productivity growth. And then we're going to take the model and we're going to take it to the data, and we're going to think about a particular episode of declining population growth in one country. So that's going to be the US. And we're going to think about the slowdown in population growth in the US over the last sort of 30, 35 years and quantify precisely these predictions we make. What should we be seeing in the data? So our point is kind of broad, but obviously all of this is taking place in an environment of changing firm dynamics, particularly in the US. So the entry rate has been declining secularly since roughly around 1980. Measures of average size, so employees per firm, have been increasing over the same time. That is really being reflected in changes of the concentration of the very largest firms. So firms of sort of 10,000 employees plus are increasing their share of employment, while smaller firms are decreasing. And the share of young firms, both in just the total number of young firms and their share of employment, has just been declining pretty much over the same period. All of these things we're going to show you are implications of declining population growth in the aggregate. So there's a long literature on models of firm dynamics. I just want to point out there are two important papers on the relationship between population growth, entry, and firm size. So that's papers by Fatih Karahan and his team, and Hugo Hoppenheim and his team. We're going to think a bit more broadly about the relationship between firm dynamics and macroeconomic aggregates. So going on to things we sort of care about, like aggregate growth and measures of markups and how they relate to this process of firm dynamics. So all I'm going to do today is outline the main idea in a basic sort of stripped down model of our main model. And then I'll discuss some of the changes we make to make it quantitatively realistic. And then I'll go over a little bit our quantitative exercise. So the basic environment in the paper is kind of very simple. There's going to be a representative household with log preferences, and the size of that household is going to be growing at some constant rate eta. So that rate eta is like the fundamental object of interest in the paper, and that's going to be the thing driving all our comparative statics. So that's just changes in the absolute size of the population or the growth rate of that population. For technology, there's going to be one final aggregate good that's composed of a bunch of differentiated varieties, where the number of those differentiated varieties is going to be endogenous and evolving as the economy grows. And also within each variety, there's going to be competition to serve that particular market. So different firms can know how to produce a particular variety, and they're going to compete within varieties. The technology to produce a particular variety that a firm will know is just really simple. It's linear in labor. So they can hire some labor to produce a particular variety, and they have some efficiency that's specific to the firm with which they produce varieties. And how's the competition within varieties going to work? Well, we're just going to say it's going to be Bertrand. So firms are going to compete via limit pricing within those varieties, and the leader is going to capture the entire variety market. So the leader within a particular variety is going to charge one of two markups. Either they'll be so far ahead of their competitors that they can charge the ideal CES markup, just sigma over sigma minus 1. Or if they can't charge that and the gap between them and the second best producer is not big enough, they're going to charge exactly at that gap in efficiencies and drive their next best competitor out of the market, capture the whole market, and then their markup is going to be the gap between them and the next best firm. Now, in this baseline, just to capture the main idea, first just assume that markups are constant and they're equal across firms at some mu. Well, if that's true, the aggregate allocations are going to look very simple. Aggregate GDP is just going to be the product of three terms. It's going to be the product of some efficiency, some average efficiency Q, some CES average efficiency Q. It'll be increasing in the number of varieties that exist in the economy at any particular time, so a kind of a love of variety motive, and it will depend on the amount of labor allocated to production to produce final output. So that's total GDP. The wage is just going to be a markdown on GDP per capita, or GDP per worker, that should be. So a markdown where that markdown is just 1 over the markup. Firm profitability per variety is just going to depend on the product of three very intuitive things. So if I deflate the profits pie of the firm by the wage, which the wage is going to be growing in equilibrium, it's going to be the product of the markup and then your efficiency relative to everyone else's efficiency. So if you start falling behind the frontier and average efficiency is rising, your profits are going to be declining because your price relative to everyone else is going to be unfavorable. And the last is going to be an endogenous market size statistic. So this is going to be a really important statistic that we think of as like average workers per product. And that's going to denote sort of total market size for your particular good. And population growth is going to affect the equilibrium value of this market size statistic. So how is entry and exit sort of going to work? Well, just think in this very simple baseline case, each worker, you can hire a worker to do research to come up with new products for your firm. And one worker is going to generate some stochastic flow rate of ideas, phi E. And if you do come up with an idea, one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to come up with a product that's already in existence, in which case you're going to improve upon that product by some fixed step size lambda, and you're going to replace the next best firm who's already producing that product. So we think of that like creative destruction. So with some chance, you're going to find something that everyone else or someone else already knows how to do. You're going to replace them and improve upon them. Or with a complementary probability 1 minus alpha, you're going to come up with something society has never seen before, an entirely new product, and you're going to be the only one that knows how to make it. So that's going to be a source of variety gains in this economy. And these probabilities in the baseline, they can be, just think of them as perfectly fixed. You can endogenize the choice of these, which way to go, creative destruction or variety gains, and it's not really going to change anything about what I'm about to say. If you do create some new variety, you're going to draw your productivity from some distribution, gamma, but that distribution is going to be linked to the overall state of average efficiency in the economy. So there's going to be a spillover from average efficiency of incumbents onto the efficiency of new entrants in creating their products, which is going to allow them to sort of keep up with the technological frontier as it evolves. And in this very baseline case, I just want you to think, well, let's say productivity is constant after birth. You just enter, you produce, and there's no post-entry dynamics. It's just an entry-exit kind of thing. But if someone else has a creative destruction event on your product and they steal it from you, that's exit for you. So that's death. You just can't do anything. Someone's better than you now, and you can't produce anymore, and you exit the market. So what does growth look like in this environment? Well, it turns out to be quite simple. So there's going to be two sources of growth, essentially. There's going to be growth through variety gains and growth through creative destruction. Growth through variety gains are going to come through the expansion in the number of products in the market. So that's going to be the number of products that are going to be growing at a rate that depends on the entry rate, the net entry rate, times that complementary probability that you invent something entirely new. And then the creative destruction rate, which we'll call tau, that's also going to depend on the entry rate, and it's just going to be tightly linked to that entry rate times alpha, with that alpha is exogenous. And the total aggregate growth rate is going to depend on the speed of creative destruction, the speed at which we're improving new things, which is linked to the entry rate, and the expansion in the number of products in the economy. So how fast the overall number of varieties is growing. So TFP is just going to be the growth in efficiency, which depends on the number of products and creative destruction, and that growth in variety term. So everything is really going to be determined by the entry rate. So both the entry rate is going to affect the growth in variety and the rate of creative destruction. So how is that entry rate determined? Well, as you might imagine, it's going to be determined by some free entry condition that I'm going to specify now. So that free entry condition is going to equate the value of a particular product to the cost of creating it somehow. So what is the value of a product? Well, you can think about the discounted value of having a product that has efficiency Q at any time t as just two terms. It's going to be the flow profits you get from making that product, where those flow profits are time dependent, because remember, average efficiency is evolving through time. And also with some rate, some endogenous rate tau, you're going to lose that product. Someone else is going to steal it, and that'll be death for you. So the solution to that equation, very simple. It's just going to be the flow profits on the top, which I told you were the product of markup, average relative efficiency, and sort of market size. And on the bottom, this is where population growth is going to come in. And it's going to come in through 3 ways. So population growth could be affecting growth in the average workers per firm. So that's your market size statistic. It could be affecting the rate at which you're falling behind the frontier, because that's average growth, that's growth in average efficiency. Or it could be affecting the death rate that you face as a firm. So free entry, we're going to equate the average value of a new product, which remember is just the value of creative destruction, increasing the productivity of someone else's good. You're going to steal them, and we're going to say that's completely undirected. You just pick a random product in the distribution and improve it, or you come up with something entirely new and take this draw over a new product distribution. And free entry is going to equate that value to the cost of coming up with a new idea for a firm. So that value is just going to be, like I said, it's just going to be linear in labor, because there's some fixed stochastic flow rate that you come up with new ideas, and you get this. So on the left-hand side is just a number. And on the right-hand side, these are all numbers as well, but where these numbers potentially depend on population growth. And also this average market size statistic, which is going to be pinned down by free entry. So the value of an average firm is going to be tied to those entry costs. Now, there's really 2 key equilibrium equations that determine everything in this very simple model. And these are going to show you how to draw out the link between population growth and kind of all these aggregates that we care about. There's the free entry condition on the right here that I just showed you. And there's also a resource constraint for the economy that determines how labor is allocated between production and between research. So I'm just going to define some notationally 2 little statistics here. I'll call LT the ratio of total labor to the total number of varieties in the economy. So think about that as like a variety intensity, number of products per person. And then I'll call STP, I'll call that the production intensity of the economy. So the total amount of labor of the whole overall pool that's allocated at any one time to producing actual stuff, okay? And these 2 equations are going to determine the equilibrium values of both of these statistics. So how's that going to work? It's a 3-step argument, and I'll step you through each one of these. So first, if there is a balanced growth path, and we show that one exists, and that we show that there's a unique balanced growth path, but if there is one, it must be that the growth in the number of products is constant, and it's some number. But if the growth in the number of products is constant, then from both of these equations, well, both of these statistics, average variety intensity in the economy and average production intensity in the economy, they both have to be fixed as well. And they're both going to be numbers on the balanced growth path. But if they're both numbers, well, then it must be that the number of products is growing at the same rate as the number of people in the economy. So what does that do? It links very tightly the growth in the number of products to this population growth rate. And remember, that links the entry rate and the creative destruction rate to just the overall population growth rate. So if a balanced growth path exists, it must be through free entry and through this resource constraint that population growth is very tightly tied to the entry rate and measures the creative destruction. So then once I've made that argument, then the rate of population growth itself, that's going to show up here in the denominator of free entry and affect the equilibrium values of the variety intensity and the production intensity of the economy. So I can just plot both of these equations just on a graph. It's going to look something like this. If I put the variety intensity on the y-axis and the share of production on the x-axis, labor market clearing is going to be an increasing relationship between these 2 things. And free entry is going to be a decreasing relationship between these variety intensity and production intensity. And then if population growth declines, that'll do 2 things. So through free entry, it's going to make the value of a firm, the value of a particular product rise. Why? Because the death rate falls, and the rate at which you fall behind the frontier, that's going to fall too. So you're going to get a downward shift in this line. And then the labor market clearing line is also going to shift out. because you need less and less, just to keep up with the frontier moving, you don't need to invest as much of the economy's aggregate labor resource in research. So they're both going to move this way, and you're going to get an unambiguous fall in the variety intensity of the economy. So the number of products per person is going to rise, but what happens to the production intensity of the economy, that's going to be ambiguous. So you get this kind of robust prediction that there are going to be more varieties per person sort of statically, and dynamically the growth rate is going to fall. So these two things are going to be in tension with each other in a way I'll show you in a sec. So now I've got all that machinery done, we can think about all the implications of declining population growth and how it's going to show up in this economy. So remember, the entry rate is just going to be tightly tied now to the growth rate in the total population. They're just going to be linked one for one. So as population growth falls, the entry rate of new firms is going to fall. Remember, creative destruction also very tightly linked to the entry rate. And so it's going to be linked to population growth in the same way. As population growth falls, creative destruction is going to fall. Aggregate growth, because it depends on creative destruction and this expansion in varieties, that's going to fall as population growth falls. And the age distribution is going to shift out to the right. Both mechanically, there's going to be, as the entry rate falls, there's going to be less firms. And endogenously, because remember that death rate depends on creative destruction. As creative destruction falls, there's going to be less death of each product, and the age distribution is going to shift out to the right. So all of these things, essentially you get in closed form, population growth falling is going to lower all of these macro aggregates. Now, so I said nothing about markups there. I held them all constant. How are we going to think about markups and some reasonable notion of the firm life cycle, growth and exit and death over the firm life cycle? So in the main model in the paper, we're going to sort of enrich this very basic framework in a couple of important dimensions. So first, we're going to add innovation by incumbents to improve their own product lines. Okay, so you're going to be able to improve the efficiency of any one of your goods by investing research effort. So this is essentially making your production more efficient by investing some effort. So if you increase the Q of your existing product, well, that's going to affect the markup that you can charge. So your relative efficiency relative to the next best firm, you can increase that gap. And that's going to give rise to a notion of endogenous markups and markups rising over the firm life cycle. So the more time you have to invest in the Q of your own product, you're going to raise more and more the gap over the next best firm, and your markup is going to get larger and larger as you age. And also there's going to be a second channel by which incumbents can innovate. They're going to be able to add new products to the portfolio of the firm. So they can come, so it's not just a one product firm anymore, but as in sort of the original Cletacortum, you're going to be able to add different products through research effort. And that's going to give a notion of growth of the firm as they age. So firms are going to get larger as they get older. So you can add these sort of channels. It's going to enrich it and make it more quantitatively realistic. But most of the results I just talked through, they go through pretty much unchanged. So as population growth falls, you're going to get less entry, less creative destruction, lower variety gains. But now you get some additional implications. So there's going to be endogenous concentration. Older firms are going to be larger. And as you shift out the age distribution with falling population growth, you're going to get more concentration of employment in larger, older firms. And the same thing is going to happen with markups. So older firms are going to have higher markups, and we're going to shift employment to these older firms. Aggregate markups are going to rise as population growth falls. So I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of how we do that, but just for time, I won't spend too much on it, and I'll get to the quantitative section in a second. But remember, I said markups are going to be determined by the efficiency gap between you and the next best producer. So we're going to reintroduce this notion of Bertrand competition within variety. The product level profits, once you do that, look very similar to the baseline case. There's some markup term here where that's potentially evolving through time. But unchanged are these notions of your efficiency relative to the average efficiency and total market size, where this responds to changes in population growth. But there's an additional term that shows up here, which is going to be an aggregate misallocation term. So if markups are not constant across firms, you're going to, as Alessandra was alluding to, you're going to get this notion that there's going to be a source of inefficiency, that high markup firms are actually not producing enough. So it's going to be linear pricing for us, and they're not going to be producing enough. Now, firm level profits, they're just going to be the sum of the profits of each particular product. So there's going to be no economies of scope here. It's just going to be, if you're a firm, you're a collection of products, and you're going to take in the profits of producing those products. So the firm needs to keep track of state variables for each product, and there's two now. One is the total efficiency with which you produce the good, and one is your gap relative to the next best firm that can produce your goods. So it's a collection of state variables that you need to track. But because there's no economies of scope, the value function is just going to be additive for us. So the value function of a collection of products is just going to separate into the sum of the values of each product. And now there's two extra terms you need to keep track of in this value. There's a creative destruction piece that was there in the baseline, but now the firm can potentially choose its own innovation rate in producing, in improving its markup and improving its efficiency for each product. And it can also choose the rate at which it adds products to its portfolio. Okay, the value of a new product doesn't look any different. It's just going to be the value of stealing someone else's product or creating something entirely new. So that's unchanged. But what you can show is, what that means is the optimal expansion rate of incumbents, you're going to choose this X such that to maximize the rate at which you get a new product minus the innovation cost. And this is going to give you something kind of interesting. What it'll give you is that you're choosing this rate optimally to deliver the value of a new product, but that value of a new product is pinned down to the entry cost of creating something new by entrants who have this linear technology. So what that means is your optimal expansion rate into new stuff, that's going to be completely unaffected by population growth, because the value of a new product has to be pinned to that entry rate on the balanced growth path. So the expansion rate of incumbents, that only depends on technology. So the expansion incentives of incumbents is not going to respond to population growth at all. What's going to happen is entrants absorb all the changes in the economy from changes in the aggregate environment. And that's a fairly robust result you can show. So what do you get in this sort of richer environment in just a couple of minutes? Well, I can think about the effect on creative destruction and entry, concentration and market size. I already talked about those, but also the effect on markups, market power, misallocation, and aggregate growth in this sort of richer setting. So in the simple setting, tau was just alpha times the entry rate. Now the creative destruction rate is alpha times the entry rate plus the expansion rate of incumbents. This is unaffected by population growth, but this is going to move with population growth. So like I said, it's going to affect creative destruction and entry, but not incumbent expansion. Changes in population growth via creative destruction are going to have effects on the firm life cycle through exit. So it's going to affect the firm's survival rate, this blue line, as firms, this is the sort of the exit rate as firms age. And it's going to affect the expansion rate as they age, their growth rate as they age, because they're going to face less competition. There's less people stealing their products because there's less entry. So you're going to get older firms endogenously, and you're going to get larger firms over the life cycle. So you're going to get both a shift in the age distribution and a shift in the behavior of firms by age that kind of interact and reinforce one another. What about the dynamics of markups over the life cycle? Well, remember, you're investing in increasing the gap between you and the next best firm. So markups are going to rise over the firm's life cycle until you get some sort of creative destruction event. And then that product level markup that you don't own anymore, that's going to reset to the original gap. And as population growth changes, that's going to affect the distribution of these markups. So in particular, you can show that you're going to get a stationary distribution of markups that's Pareto, where the tail index of that Pareto distribution depends on the population growth rate, because population growth affects creative destruction. And what you can show is that lower population growth is going to give you higher markups. So the markup distribution is going to shift out to the right and increasing misallocation. And lastly, the effects on aggregate growth are pretty much unchanged. You're going to get falling population growth is going to reduce growth both through creative destruction and through falling entry rates. Okay, so in these last couple of minutes, I'll do the quantitative implications of declining population growth and how we actually think about taking this sort of model to the data. But our quantitative exercise is going to be rather simple. So what we're going to do is just think about just first of all, a comparative static where we take the model on a balanced growth path where the population growth rate is 2%, so roughly what it was in the US in sort of the 1980s. And then we cause the population growth rate to decline to 1%. So something about where it was just pre-crisis. And then we think about how these things trace out quantitatively. Now, just one note, this is the labor force growth rate. For the purposes of our model, there's going to be no distinction between population growth and labor force growth. We're not going to have an endogenous labor supply choice or sort of cohort dependent age dynamics, but there's also a lot of important work that deals with those sort of effects. So what we're going to do, we're going to calibrate the model to moments in 1980 of the firm dynamics process with a population growth rate of 2%, and then we're going to lower it to 1% and think about both the changes in the long run balanced growth path of that change and the transitional dynamics. So we can just trace out either the path for population growth as it appears here, or we can just think about a linear decline in population growth from 2% to 1% and trace it through the model. How are we going to calibrate the model? Where there's basically 7 key parameters that you need to think about. So there's the expansion cost, how much it costs to expand into new products, the product improvement rate, or the cost of doing that, of increasing your markups over other firms. And we're going to target these 2 things from, we're going to use the US Census microdata on the whole universe of firms. And we're going to think about targeting the 10-year sales growth of firms and the 10-year markup growth of firms over their life cycle. We're going to think about picking the entry cost. All that's going to influence in the model is average firm size, and we'll take that also from the LBD in 1980. The average productivity of new products, so what productivity, if you create something new, entirely new, what is the average productivity of that entering product? That's going to influence the tail index of employment in the efficiency distribution. So we'll pick that to match the tail index of employment. We'll pick 2 other parameters to affect aggregate statistics. So have blue to think about aggregate statistics and orange to think about firm level statistics. So I need to pick the GDP growth rate in 1980. We'll take that as 2%. And then we'll also pick the aggregate product profit share from the probability with which you invent a new product. Because if you invent a new product, you're going to charge the full CES markup. So that's going to influence the aggregate profit share. And then we're also going to introduce, I haven't done this yet, but we'll introduce some exogenous death rate. And that's going to be used to pick the firm entry rate in equilibrium. So 7 numbers, and we're going to calibrate them to match all these moments exactly. So the 2 more interesting non-standard ones are these life cycle growth in sales and markups that we're going to take from the longitudinal business database, the US Census. So this in blue is the data here. This is sales for all the firms for which we have sales data for, about 70% of the firms in the LBD. How do sales evolve with the life cycle of the firm? You can see them kind of here. And markups we're going to take as inverse labor shares. So we don't have sort of detailed materials data for the universe of US firms. You can do it for manufacturing, but not for the universe. We're going to take it as inverse labor shares. And these are how, in percentage points, inverse labor shares evolve over the life cycle of the firm in the US Census. So we think we're sort of the first to at least document this. And we're going to target 10-year growth in both of these things by picking those 2 numbers I showed you before. So we're only picking 2 numbers, but the fit over the life cycle is fairly good, we think, in terms of sales and markup growth. The markup growth kind of flattens out a bit before the top in our model versus the data, but that's kind of what it is. Of course, there's a whole bunch of non-targeted stuff we don't pick that the model does fairly well on. It gets the exit rates by age kind of almost exactly right, and that's coming from these product expansion and product exit dynamics. And although we only pick the sort of the far tail of the employment distribution and average firm size, you get pretty much the whole distribution looking very like what is in the data. So in terms of our counterfactual or our very simple comparative static exercise, if I lower the population growth from 2% to 1% from the calibrated baseline, I go from an entry rate of almost 12% to about an entry rate of 1%, which is pretty much exactly what happened in the data between sort of 1980 and 2010-ish. Average firm size, we kind of get a little bit more of an increase than what happens in the data. But this is, we show in the transitional dynamics piece that this is kind of a more slow moving element than the entry rate. So the entry rate falls fairly quickly with population growth. Average firm size sort of takes longer to respond, as you might imagine. So we think we're kind of trending in the right direction here anyway to something that looks like what we get out of the model. The share of young firms as well, that also decreases pretty much in line with the model once you do a 2% to 1% decline. And the employment share in terms of the delta looks pretty good. The calibrated baseline, we're not matching where the data is, but in terms of the change between the calibrated baseline and the 1% decline, it looks pretty much like what's going on in the data. Now, what about these more things we care about for welfare, like the growth rate and markups? Well, if you get a 1% decline in population growth, that's going to slow the growth in GDP by about 0.2%. So sort of like 1/5 of the decline in population growth is going to slow the growth rate by 1/5 of whatever that is. But there's static versus dynamic effects here going on. So that's going to be the long run growth rate, but the variety intensity of the economy is going to increase. So as each product gets more profitable because they die less often and they fall behind the frontier less often, you're going to get a surge of entry into an initial surge of entry that's going to raise the variety intensity of the economy. So the ratio of the number of products to workers is going to rise initially. And that's going to be a static effect that at least partially offsets this long run dynamic effect at the start. So you can kind of see this in the transitional dynamics. So if you start lowering the population growth from 2% to 1%, roughly over the horizon that it's been doing in the US data, something like 20 years, you get a GDP per capita growth rate that looks like this. First, it starts rising as entrants kind of rush in to take advantage of the increased profitability of each product. And then the long run growth effect starts to dominate as we go further and further along. So you don't expect the aggregate growth rate to respond straight away, basically, as population growth starts declining. But in the end, there's kind of no avoiding it. Population growth slowdown is going to kind of cause declines in aggregate growth. So I guess I'm sort of 2 minutes early, but I guess what we wanted to say with this paper was basically the secular decline in population growth we think is pretty widespread across nations, and we think it's bound to continue. And it's likely to have pretty important impacts on the process of firm dynamics and aggregate growth, and indeed their interaction. So you would likely expect lower entry and lower rates of creative destruction through changes in the incentives of firms to enter. You're going to expect a rise in concentration and increases in average size, a rise in markups, which I didn't touch on here, but they increase something like 1 to 2%, and a fall in the aggregate growth rate. And we think, at least for the case of the US, when you take the model seriously and take it to the data, it looks like these effects are going to be quantitatively important to understand changes in business dynamism and changes in growth and misallocation. Cool. So that's all I had. So thanks a lot for having me here.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Conor, for ending on time. Just to remind everybody who wants to ask a question, please raise your hands, and then we'll be able to unmute you and let you speak. And I already see, I certainly have a question, but there is already a question from the audience. So Jinglong, you're allowed to talk, so you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to raise the question. This is a fantastic presentation. Thanks very much. I have just one question regarding the discount rate. So it seems to me that you have exogenously set the discount rate to a constant value, but we also know that the real interest rate, for instance, has decreased by about 5% in the last 4 decades. So I wonder whether you have also calibrated a model by also changing the discount rate, because I'm according to my understanding, the key mechanism in your model is a Bellman equation, so it should be very sensitive to discount rate. Have you ever tried to do that? And does it?
That's fair. No, exactly. You're right. So like the interest rate in our economy, because we have log preferences, is just going to be that exogenous discount rate plus the growth rate. The growth rate is going to decline, but not that much. So definitely it's not explaining the entire decline in interest rates in the US. We have played around with sort of CRRA specifications, and sort of qualitatively, it doesn't really change much, but quantitatively it would, depending on what your coefficient of relative risk aversion is. But yeah, so I mean, I think I would say we don't think this is sort of the main thing driving the secular decline in interest rates. It may be contributing to it, but that part of the Bellman equation is not what our sort of focus is on. We were more thinking about these like death rate effects falling behind the frontier effects in the denominator of the Bellman equation. But it's a great point.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. So anybody who's interested in asking questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. In the meantime, I actually have a question for you guys, which is this, the context in which this population growth decline is happening is one in which, if you think about, endogenous fertility model with a quality quantity trade-off, there's an increase in the quality, of offspring. And so part of the reasons that we are all having fewer children is that we want to invest more in the education of our children. So we have potentially a more skilled labor force. So what kind of role does that play, in your framework, or, could it play, both in terms of the cost and the incentive to innovate, the cost and the incentive of creating new products? How do you guys think about this?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is we're kind of punting on it, and then we didn't think about the supply of entrepreneurial talent, which you might think would be affected by something like the age distribution, right? So we know that there are important life cycle effects on your ability or your likelihood to innovate that are sort of being documented now. We wanted to focus more on this aggregate macro profitability channel, but definitely those sort of channels are there too. And you could think they might go multiple ways. So I mean, there's been work documenting that like high ability entrepreneurs actually tend to be a bit older than we thought. So they might be in their mid 40s. And as the age distribution shifts out, you actually might get an increase in entrepreneurship for a while. Or there could be channels like what you're saying is, we invest more in the quality of each children, and their propensity to become an entrepreneur actually increases as population growth slows down. Yeah, we think all those things are possible and certainly interesting. We just wanted to try and focus in on one particular macro environment channel, I would say. I don't know, Michael, if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. So there's one extension which we do, which might be sort of interesting on that dimension. We don't do exactly what you have in mind, but I think it could give you a framework to think about it. So we have an extension of the model where we allow researchers and production workers to be imperfectly substitutable. And so, one key property of the model, which Conor highlighted, is that as population growth declines and the value of the firm goes up, sort of how quickly is it to kind of move researchers into this activity to kind of arbitrage away these extra profits and to make the free entry condition hold. And so I think one way you could maybe think about this quality quantity trade-off, if this decline in population growth comes with basically a shift out of the labor supply schedule towards these research efforts, I think my intuition is that this would almost complement our results. I would need to think about this more, but I think it would complement our results because it would almost make kind of the research labor part of the model kind of more elastic than you would have thought otherwise. But we would need to think about this more, but I think that would be kind of one maybe interesting way on how you can put these kind of two aspects of the fertility decline together.
Okay, no, that's actually an interesting way to think about it. So, and it's typically absent in the models that endogenize, fertility growth and the distribution of skills and the amount of skills in the population. So I think that's really an area where maybe the two literatures should speak to each other a little bit more, and we could make more progress. I have Morten. also has a question, but I have another thing that I quickly wanted to ask you, because a key mechanism in your paper is that the size of the population is the size of the market. But I was thinking that if you think about it in a global setting, right, the size of your market depends on the global market. And it's true that world population overall is growing at a lower rate, but for certain type of particularly elite products, what really matters is that many developing economies are becoming richer. So even if overall population is growing, in fact, the market is declining. I'm sorry. In fact, the market is growing. Again, how do I think about that in the context, of your work?
It's a great point. I mean, you could think of it as like an offsetting effect, that in the short run, at least, the global market is going to be expanding quite quickly as sort of China and India grows particularly fast. It's going to be, quantitatively, it's going to be to what extent are the products of the US economy tradable versus not tradable when you think about the entire firm size distribution. So if, some fraction of the US or some large fraction of the US GDP is just non-tradable, then our channel is going to dominate as population growth slows. If we're really thinking about elite superstar firms that are trading all over the world, then it's going to go exactly the opposite way. So, this market size effect works both directions symmetrically. So as we have growth in the world economy, you would actually expect increases in creative destruction and growth, offsetting some of that.
Okay, so we still have a few minutes if somebody has additional questions. Morten, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had one, but it's possible you answered already. I was thinking with population aging, if there's decline in birth rate, but people stay in good health for longer, I don't know if that would work the same way as your answer to the other question or not.
In what particular part? So I guess there's the entrepreneurship side, I guess, and then there's the overall market size side. And that would be I guess it would be a transitional phenomenon as sort of the birth rate's declining, but lifespans are increasing. Eventually one of those is gonna, lifespans, maybe they can keep growing forever, I don't know, but one of those will dominate in terms of population growth.
Yeah, but I guess there would be an impact on labor supply through.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, sort of we don't have it in this current version of the paper, but we were sort of playing around with a kind of very simple sort of demographic model where you have, people are born, they sort of enter the pool of, let's call it unemployed, then they get matched to a firm, and then at some point they die. And so, in that model, as you can imagine, you can maybe think about it that the birth rate is going down, but at the end of the day, kind of the transition rate of the labor force into death is also slowing down. And from there, as you can imagine, like the total labor supply growth rate, what is ADA in our context, it depends on the birth rate and like the share of people in kind of the second state, and then the extent to which they transition out. So as Conor highlighted, along a balanced growth path, at the end of the day, it's going to be a function of this declining birth rate. But I could totally see that over a non-trivial time horizon, that actually the decline in the birth rate is sort of an overstatement of the decline in the labor force growth rate, because you have these kind of second effects in there whereby people start, they keep working for a little more.
I mean, speaking to that as well, something that was bubbling in the back of my mind is that there has been, at least in advanced economies or rich economies, an increase in leisure. So, which is more of I don't think it's so much a decline in participation per se, conditional on age, but sort of reduction on the intensive margin. And I don't know, I mean, that could play a role in your framework in a couple of ways. One, affecting just like, how many workers or how much work there is available on the supply side, but also the kinds of products that are demanded as well, right? So any, goods and services complementary to leisure. And it could be that those products are, it's less productive to produce those products, or the productivity is lower in the manufacture of those products and so on. So that's another thing that would interact, with the type and quality of labor, this fact of the increase in leisure. A part of it is accounted for by the aging of the population, but part of it is not from the time use data. So that's something else. Okay, so last call, we're actually out of time. So I think we're gonna be ending exactly on time. So if anybody wants to engage in some more informal discussion, please copy the link to the Zoom room, which is in the chat, and you can join us there. I'd like to thank Alessandra, Conor, and Michael as well for very engaging presentations and discussions so far, and wish everybody a nice summer, given that this is the last talk for the season. Thanks so much, and see you in the Zoom room.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I'll keep this going for another